All right, so before we quickly start, inshallah, apart from that, I just want to do a quick reminder. I want to start off every session with a quick reminder for a couple of minutes only, and that's because we're human beings, and human beings need reminders. And this question of Palestine, we talked about it last week. It's not a 2-week campaign. It's not a 2 months campaign. Already we discussed last week. It's already been 75 years. It's already been 75 years. So if you think it's a short campaign for 2 weeks or 2 months, then it's the wrong. It's a complete. You're going to be really disappointed, right? You're going to be disappointed. It's not a short campaign. It's a long campaign, and a long campaign. What happens? We have our peaks, and then we have our low points, right? So right now, we're all going through a peak. Why are we going through a peak? Because all of us are agitated because of the circumstances, right? Right now, you could turn on the TV, Al Jazeera, not BBC. Al Jazeera, you turn that on, and you will see the current circumstances facing the Al Shifa hospital, right? We're going to be agitated by that. We're really going to be moved by that, and we really want to, we're really going to be feeling like doing something, right? But in a couple of weeks' time, when, like I said before, there's a quick ceasefire, those things are not being covered in the media, then we'll dip also. We'll forget about Palestine. We'll forget about Gaza. We'll forget about liberating of the liberation of Palestine, the occupation of Palestine. So that's why we're believers, and the believers need reminders, right? And the reminder is that last night when I was checking, 11,261 deaths so far, 4,506 children. And right now they're discussing the premature babies that are on the verge, if not already passed away. And even if they survive, imagine what is their future. Are their parents alive? Are their brothers alive? Are their sisters alive? How many family members have already been deceased? So just bear that in mind, inshallah. And every week, every day, I want us to remember and remind ourselves so that we continue the iman within our souls, within our hearts, and we continue this campaign, because to support Palestine and to be part of the campaign and to be part of the grassroots change that we're trying to drive within the ummah, it's a long-term campaign. It's not a short-term campaign. So please, let's just bear that in mind, inshallah. All right, so let's move on, inshallah. Let's move on. Today is session 2. We're going to be discussing a brief history, a very brief history of Palestine. We're going to be discussing the people of Palestine, and we're going to be discussing rule of Palestine, the rulers of Palestine. I think this is very important, just for us to understand the context. Because then what will happen next week is we'll start discussing, okay, the creation of the state of Israel, right? And we come right up to date. It's still going to be a bit historical, but we come up to date in terms of the current reality as it exists, right? So today's session, I think, is going to be very important, like last week's session, just to build that context, appreciation, understanding, etc. Inshallah, right? So we're going to be discussing a brief historical overview. Let me go through the agenda. We're gonna firstly we'll start with, all right, what is Palestine? Who are the people of Palestine? Who have ruled Palestine? And I'm gonna start with a couple of questions, and then we're gonna go on to we're gonna fast forward to how Palestine was opened up by the Muslims and Islam. How did it come under Islam, right? Then we will discuss a couple of other key events in history, i.e., when the Crusaders occupied Palestine. How did that happen? When did that happen? How did Palestine come back under Islamic rule, right? And then, inshallah ta'ala, we'll open it up for questions and answers, right? So that's the agenda for today. In between, we're going to try to take a break so that, inshallah, everyone gets a bit of a breather and everyone gets the opportunity to go to the washroom or take a quick drink, inshallah. So that's the plan, right? If you've got questions, if you're online and you've got questions, we've got about 34, 35 people online at the moment. If you've got any questions online, then you can start sharing those questions online in the chat, and Imran, who's the facilitator, he will put those questions together, and inshallah we'll address those questions towards the end or towards in the middle of the sessions. And if you've got questions here, please raise your hands. But very quickly, all right, let's move on. I want to open up with a couple of questions, right? First question: how valid is the Zionist claim to a so-called biblical right to the land of Palestine, right? So I want you to think about that question. If the question doesn't make sense, tell me. I'll try to repeat it, but there's a lot to cover, so I want to move on. Hopefully it should make some sense. Some of you might not understand some of the details, but please bear with me. So how valid is the Zionist claim to a so-called biblical right to the land of Palestine? First question. Second question, right? How long did the Jewish people rule over Palestine? How long did the Jewish people rule over Palestine? Right? Right? Who were the rulers of Palestine? Who ruled over Palestine? I don't mean each individual ruler, but I mean generally a dynasty or a grouping of people, right? So who were the rulers of Palestine? Who ruled Palestine? All right? Okay, that's the first couple of questions. Then I've got a couple of other questions. I'm just going to throw them out. The idea is to get you thinking. All right? What about the land of Khaybar? The land of Banu Nadir, Banu Qurayza, Banu Kainuqa, right? Have you heard of these names before? Have you heard of these names before? What are these names? These are names of tribes. These are names of Jewish tribes that existed in Arabia. So historically, if you talk about historically, then the Jews used to live in the Hijaz too. So by extension, do they also have right to that land? Because they used to live there once upon a time, right? And if you extend the argument further, what about the Palestinians? No one denies that the Palestinians used to live or live in that territory. So by using the same argument, you can counter argument and say then Palestinians have got a right of their own land, right? Okay. Also take into consideration a couple of other points, right? So first point, what about the claim of any indigenous people? The claim of any indigenous people. Talk about the indigenous people of Australia or the indigenous people of America, right? Who were exterminated by the colonizers, and those lands were then taken over by these colonists, by these colonialists. And we're talking about not hundreds of thousands, even some estimates say 56, listen to this, European settlers killed 56 million indigenous people over about 100 years in South, Central, and North America, etc., etc. So you're talking about millions of people that were wiped out by these colonizers, and they took over those lands, and then they said this land belongs to us. We were the people who were the first people who founded this area. So America, Australia, right? And then very quickly, lastly, a lot of you will remember this example, the Babri Masjid. Do you remember Babri Masjid in India, right? So what happened in Babri Masjid? Babri Masjid was a masjid that was built in the 16th century, years ago, hundreds of years ago, right? And then the far-right Hindu fascist government came into power. Obviously, far-right Hindu nationalism was the token of, was the you know, obviously the mantra of the day. And then the far-right, they claimed that this place was the place historically, hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years ago, God knows how far they went back. They said that was the birthplace of one of their gods. And it used to be a temple many, many hundreds of years ago. And we all know what happened. They then destroyed the masjid and they built a temple. Right? So what I want to do is I want to start your thinking process that when you talk about a biblical right to a land, how legitimate is that question? How do we address it? How do we tackle it? How do we rebuttal it? Right? And what are the implications of a notion like that? What does that mean then? What happens if you start extending that? And then you got some of these examples that I've given you, right? All right, so let's move on. So I'm not going to answer those questions for you firstly right now. That's the first thing. And second thing, I'm hoping that once we go through this discussion today, you can start answering those questions yourself. And inshallah, hopefully, I'll give you enough information to start answering those questions yourself. So you should know by the end of this course, or sorry, by end of today's session, some of the answers to these questions, yeah? All right, so let's move on, right? So let's start with brief history. And like I said to you, it's going to be a brief history. All right, and very, very quickly, I'm going to say to you that even when I used to be at school, I used to find history very boring, right? And I never paid attention when it came to history classes, unless it's a history of a particular area, a particular people that, you know, obviously has an interest for you, right? And obviously Masjid al-Aqsa for me, Palestine for me, it has a personal touch, it has a personal, as I said last week, it's linked to our aqidah, our belief. So it should be relevant to all of us, quite frankly. But nevertheless, history is boring and it can be boring. I appreciate that. So my first challenge was, how do I make it interesting, right? And how do I make it interactive, right, to some extent? And how do you take away some, how do I give some clear takeaways, right, from the discussion today? And I thought, let's look at Palestine. And unfortunately, I don't think a lot of you have got slides. I don't know why, but if you have slides, look at the slides. But if you have, great. How do we, when we look at Palestine, I thought, let's start with prophets. If you start with prophets, very quickly you can map out what's happening in Palestine or in that area, right? So you start with prophets. So which prophet do you start with? Okay, and then we start with prophets. Then we look at some of the empires, and then we will look at who rules Palestine and for how long, right? And a couple of other interesting points that I'll mention. All right. All right. A few definitions before we continue, right? You might hear me talk about Canaan or Canaanites, right? These are people on a very old civilization that basically, think of it. Last week, remember I said to you about Bilad al-Sham. Bilad al-Sham is a region that Palestine, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, all of these areas belong to. Today, you have them all split up. Before, historically in Islam, you don't have this area split up. It's all called Bilad al-Sham. So the people of Canaan, historically in the Bible and in the Torah, they refer to as Canaan. It refers to the area. It's like saying European Union, right? Or it's like saying America today, right? So obviously, back in those days, Canaan was a region. That area was called Canaan, and the people that lived in that area were obviously called the Canaanites. So okay. So that's the first thing, right? And then we talk about Israel, Yaqub. Okay, that's interchangeable. So Yaqub alayhi salam is also known as Israel. And then very quickly, we talk about BC, BCE. We talk about BC, when you talk about years, is before Christ. So time is generally referred to as, dates are generally referred to as before Christ, before Isa alayhi salam was born, or before his arrival. And then after Isa alayhi salam, which is normally known as AD, right? Or CE, which is Common Era, or AD, which is the Latin for after Christ, yeah? All right, so that's just a few quick definitions. I think that's enough, right? So if we start with brief history, let's start off with the prophets, right? And we've got a couple of minutes to just quickly recap that. Which prophet do we start from? Anyone very quickly from the floor? Which prophet do we start from? Musa alayhi salam, all right? Right, we start with Ibrahim alayhi salam, right? We start with Ibrahim alayhi salam because that's where it all starts from Ibrahim alayhi salam. The prophets before that, obviously, is a very, very more historical, and we don't have, even when we talk about Ibrahim alayhi salam and from the period after Ibrahim alayhi salam, there's obviously difference of opinion on a lot of the dates, and no, there's no actual information. It's just what researchers believe, right? But it's the good starting point is Ibrahim alayhi salam. Ibrahim alayhi salam. And then you look at the prophets and you ask yourself the question, how many of these prophets were actually rulers? How many of these prophets were actually rulers, right? So you start from Ibrahim alayhi salam, Ishaq alayhi salam. We're talking about almost, let's say 2,500 years before Jesus. Not from here, from today, before Jesus. Was Ibrahim alayhi salam a ruler? Sorry? Very quickly. No, he wasn't. Ibrahim alayhi salam wasn't a ruler. We know Ibrahim alayhi salam, he constantly traveled. He was from the area of, we know he was born in Iraq, right? Modern day Iraq, right? And then from there, he travels to Jerusalem, that area. We know he travels from there to Mecca, etc., etc. So he's constantly traveling and is constantly engaging with the authorities at that time, kings, the rulers of that time. So Ibrahim alayhi salam is not a ruler, all right? Where do we go next from Ibrahim alayhi salam? Ishaq alayhi salam, his son, right? And then really the majority of the history and the conversation starts from Yaqub alayhi salam, Bani Israel. Bani Israel is the children of Israel. Israel is Yaqub, the prophet Yaqub. Yes? So now we're talking about Yaqub, we're talking about Yusuf, all right? So where did Yaqub alayhi salam, Yusuf alayhi salam live? Sorry? Where? Right, in Canaan, in the area of Canaan, in Jerusalem, remember? And then what happens there is the famine. It's the famine. Obviously, Yusuf alayhi salam, he gets taken anywhere to Egypt, right? And then there's a famine. And as a result of the famine, long story short, the brothers and the whole family migrate to Egypt, where Yusuf alayhi salam, he's in a position of ruling, right? He's a minister, but he's not the ruler. So even during the period of Yaqub, Yusuf alayhi salam, are they in a position of ruling? They're not ruling at that time, right? And this is, of course, now when we're talking about Yaqub alayhi salam, and we're talking about the Bani Israel. So Bani Israel, you have got the 12 tribes of Bani Israel. They're all living in that area, right? But they're not ruling. And then we fast forward to Musa alayhi salam, Harun alayhi salam, Yusha bin Nun, etc., etc. None of them were rulers. We know Musa alayhi salam, he doesn't enter the promised land. We know Harun alayhi salam doesn't enter the promised land, right? Later, we know that the Bani Israel, they enter into the promised lands, right? Firstly through Joshua, right? Yusha bin Nun, and then through Dawood alayhi salam and Sulaiman alayhi salam, right? So that's about 1000 BC. So it's during the time of Sulaiman alayhi salam, it's during the time of Dawood alayhi salam and Sulaiman alayhi salam that finally they start ruling. So Sulaiman alayhi salam, was he a ruler? That's what everyone knows. Sulaiman alayhi salam, of course he was a ruler, right? Dawood alayhi salam, was he a ruler? He was a ruler because Allah tells us the stories of Dawood and Sulaiman in the Quran as rulers. So they're now ruling, and this is the first time the Jewish people are actually ruling over that land. And where is Dawood alayhi salam and Sulaiman? Where are they living? They're living in Jerusalem. That's why they built the temple. There was the so-called temple, the masjid, right? So this is the first time that Bani Israel are in that region as rulers. Not as just living there, but they're actually ruling, right? Through their prophets, King Dawood or Prophet Dawood, Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam, and so on and so forth, right? Cut long story short, the rule of Sulaiman and Dawood alayhi salam, it doesn't last for very long. Some commentators say, researchers say 40 years. 40 years of Dawood alayhi salam, 40 years of Sulaiman alayhi salam, and after that, the kingdom of it was called the kingdom of Israel. It gets dismantled, and then eventually it gets taken over by another of those empires, right? So that's with regards to the prophets. After obviously Dawood alayhi salam, after the other prophets, right? Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam, etc., etc. You get so many prophets. The list is almost endless, right? You know, you get Zakaria alayhi salam, you get Yunus alayhi salam, you get who else you get? You get not Yusuf, you got Isa alayhi salam, etc., etc. But during all of that period, the Jews are not in a position of ruling. Isa alayhi salam, Jesus, did he rule? He didn't rule. Right? The prophets before that, did they rule? No, they went to nations where there was already rulers in place, right? So that's the point to note here, right? That when you look at that area, if it sounds complicated, the easiest way to do is break it down by prophets, and you know what periods the Bani Israel ruled or didn't rule, right? So I'm taking too long on this. All right, so if you now look at the dynasties, right? And if you look at, okay, who were the key people that were ruling over Palestine, right? Historically. So the original people that were ruling over that area of Canaan or the area of Palestine are known as the Canaanites, right? And the Egyptians. According to a lot of the research, they say the Egyptians and the Canaanites, they were the ones who ruled over Jerusalem for almost 3,500 years, right? This is well before Isa alayhi salam, for that period, right? So they were the people that used to rule that area. The Philistines, the people that are known as Philistines, they and their ancestors lived in modern day Palestine centuries ago, right? So you can go back centuries ago that there's in fact archaeological work has been done, and those studies actually suggest and actually trace back the history of the modern day Palestinians to that period, right? That they for example, they settled on the Mediterranean coast, Jaffa, Gaza, and so on and so forth, right? But the first rulers of that area were the people of Canaan, right, and the Egyptians. So that's the first thing to know. Then we talked about the Jewish rule, right? According to many of the researchers and many of the scholars, they then say, okay, the Jewish, they ruled for a period of time. We'll discuss how long did they rule for in a moment. And after that, it was a combination of some of the old empires, right? So you might have heard of the Persian Empire, you might have heard of the Roman Empire, the Byzantium Empire, and you've heard of the Babylonian Empire, right? The area of of Iraq, historical Iraq. They all ruled. So it's it's like today, modern day, where you've got different empires, and different empires are at war, and one day one empire wins, and one day another empire wins, and that's exactly what happened historically. And the empires that ruled over that area were the Canaans, the Babylons, the Persians, the Romans, the Byzantiums, and so on and so forth. Eventually, what happens is, who comes along? Sorry? Is the Muslims. So the last empire that was ruling was the Byzantiums, and after the Byzantiums, the Islamic Khilafah, the Caliphate, comes to that area and starts to rule that region, right? So if you actually look at the slides will tell you the dates, and it'll tell you how long they ruled for, right? So that's the first point. Now, if we quickly move fast forward, and we talk about how long did each of these dynasties rule over Jerusalem or that area, this is when it becomes really interesting. So who do you think is at position number 3? Okay, and there's 3 or 4 people in this grouping. So the ones who have ruled the minimum amount of time over that region are the Jews, right? So a maximum, they say that the Jewish people ruled over that area, that region, for 2 centuries. 2 centuries means 200 years, on and off, right? So 40 years here, then someone else came along, then 40 years here, someone else came along, etc., etc. It was a constant flurry of time periods, right? And their most notable time periods were under Sulaiman alayhi salam, Dawood alayhi salam. You're talking about 1,000 years before Jesus, not 1,000 years now, 1,000 years before Jesus, right? Number 2 are the Christians, right? The Christians, the Roman Empire, the Byzantium Empire. And then if you want to include the Crusaders into that, right, they ruled over the region of Palestine for nearly 4 centuries, for nearly 400 years, since the beginning of history, right? And then you come to the Muslims at number 1, at number 1 position. The Muslims have ruled over Palestine for how long? 1,000, almost 1,200 years. 1,200 years, right? And it's something that I don't think we really appreciate that fact and these facts. When you actually break it down into, okay, how long and who's been ruling over that land, 1,200 years, the Muslims have ruled over Palestine. And we're gonna go into the detail. So when I asked you the questions in the beginning, now I ask you the same question: who has the best claim and the best right of rule over Palestine? I'm not talking, last week we talked about from an Aqidah perspective, right? From an Islamic perspective. This is not the reason for our argument, but even if you wanted to use this argument, can you see it outweighs any other argument? The Muslims have ruled over that land for 1,200 years, right? For 1,200 years. And now you come and you say, we have a biblical right, and a biblical right that goes back to Abraham, which is 4,000 years, it's 5,000 years. It's almost absurd. It's ridiculous to even suggest that and even entertain that as a conversation, as an argument. Right? So that's something that should be very clear to all of us, please. Right? So to wrap up this part, right, the Jewish claim that they are the original inhabitants of that area is very easily dismissed. Yes, they lived in that region. No one's saying that they didn't live in that region. They lived in that region. So did the Palestinians, right? Just because you live in that region doesn't necessarily give you the right to rule that region. We've lived in, we can say, oh, we've lived in the UK now for the last 50 years, 60 years, 70 years. Does that give you no right to become the rulers of that country? I mean, you can try it if you want and see what happens, right? So that's a flawed argument, quite frankly, right? So anyway, the point was the Palestinians, the Jewish people, the Semitic people generally that they refer to, they have lived and they have been there right from the beginning. But when we talk about rule, who has ruled over that land, you can see the facts speak for themselves, right? So that's very, very important, right? But like I said to you, from our perspective, we don't use that as an argument to say the Muslims should be ruling over Palestine. We argue that the Muslims should be ruling over Palestine and have responsibility for Palestine because of historical reasons, from the Islamic Aqidah, right? And because it's an obligation. And that's what we were trying to discuss last week. The fact that we've ruled over it for 1,200 years also adds to that, because it means it was Islamic lands, and Islamic lands are always Islamic lands. They can't be given away. Right. So that's a very quick kind of a ride through history, a ride through the different peoples, right? And different empires, different dynasties that ruled over the Palestine. The last thing that I'm going to say to you are some of the key events that happen in history. Generally, people refer to them, so it's good for you to know about it, right? And it's also good for you to know about it in the modern context. What are the key events that have happened historically in that region? Well, firstly, we know that under Sulaiman Islam, that's when Sulaiman Islam builds this masjid, right? Temple, they call it temple, the Temple of Solomon, right? So Sulaiman Islam, back in the, what was it, 2003, 1000 BC, right? He builds the Temple of Solomon, right? What happens to that Temple of Solomon? Do we know what happens to it? Sorry? It was destroyed. Who destroys the Temple of Solomon? Sorry? Right, so the Babylons, the first people to destroy it are the Babylons, I believe, right? The Babylons are the ones, it's an empire, right? So Babylon obviously was a very a great empire in its own days. It was like America of today, right? A great civilization, right? A lot of people refer to it as the cradle of civilization. So the Babylons, when they came and they took over Jerusalem and they conquered it, they destroyed that temple that Sulaiman al-Islam built. They destroyed it. Then later, right, that temple gets rebuilt, I think under the Persians, right? It gets rebuilt. So then, like I said to you, then the Babylons, they get defeated by the Persians, I think it was. So the Persians, they come in, they start ruling over Jerusalem, right? And then once they're ruling over Jerusalem, they allow the Jews back in, they rebuild the temple, right? And then what happens to it the second time? Sorry? Right. So then the second time is the Romans, when they are ruling over that area, they come and they destroy the temple, right? They don't just destroy the temple, they execute, they persecute, they take into captivity, they exile the Jewish people, right? So this is very important for us to know. You have to understand, you have to know this. Historically, we're talking about, thousands of years of history. If you look at the thousands of years of history, they talk about Muslims being anti-Semitic or you're being anti-Semitic and you're being anti-Jewish. Our whole history is evident of the fact that it was never the Muslims that persecuted the Jews or persecuted Judaism. It was never. It was always the opposite, but that's later. We'll discuss it. It was the Romans, it was the other empires that actually historically persecuted the Jews in that region, destroyed their temples, right? Exiled the Jews from that area, and the Jews were only allowed back in later. We'll discuss it. I don't want to mention it now. So that's one point, right? Then if there's another notable point that we should maybe raise, no, in fact, we'll raise this later. That's it, right? So the temple gets destroyed twice. How were the Jewish people treated historically? That's something that we should know. And it's something that we should be able to articulate. And we also need to know that, because when you talk about the current dynamics of Palestine and Masjid al-Aqsa, right? And you must have heard about this campaign of the Zionists to rebuild the temple, right? So very quickly, when I was talking about Al-Aqsa last week, everyone knows about the Wailing Wall. The Wailing Wall is the wall that exists in Masjid al-Aqsa, right next to the mosque, right, of the Masjid al-Aqsa itself, right? It exists where the Jewish people go and they worship, right? So it's just a wall. That wall is the only thing that remains from the temple, whether it's the original temple or the temple that they built the second time. That is the only wall that exists. So everything else was destroyed. That wall remains. And the fascinating thing about Jerusalem is anyone who's been there, it's a shame about Makkah and Medina is that the Jerusalem, a lot of that historical old city of Jerusalem remains intact. Actually, when you go there, you see the walls around Jerusalem, you see the gates, you still see the Bab al-Umar, the gate of Umar ibn al-Khattab that he actually came through, and he opened up of Al-Aqsa. I remember when I went there, we actually stayed in the masjid where Salahuddin Ayyubi stayed the night before he opened up Al-Aqsa. So all of those historic places are still there, and you can see them. But that Wailing Wall is the only remnants of the temple of Sulaiman alayhi salam. And that is part of the Zionist agenda to rebuild the temple on the same site of the original temple of Solomon. So that's one of the Zionist, agenda items, and you'll see that. You'll hear people talking about their Zionist planning and plotting for Al-Aqsa. That's what they talk about, and that's why they always try to storm that compound, which they're not allowed to go into, even from an international law perspective. But they do that all the time. That doesn't stop them. All right. How we're doing for we started about 6:40. So I think we're at the end of the first part. The first part, the idea was just to give you a brief historical overview. I mean, I could mention dates, but it's not worth it because the slides are there. By the way, we've got slides. I've sent you guys the links. So access the slides. All of that information is there. The dates are there. You should have it on your WhatsApp messages, right? But let's just open up if we've got any questions on this point, on the first point that we've discussed, on the first topic. And the first topic is brief history, the people of Palestine, of that region, and who have been the rulers, who have ruled the Palestine historically. Is there any questions from the floor, or if there's questions even from online, we can take those, Imran.
Yeah, we have a few questions.
Okay.
So one of the questions was, somebody said that there were no Palestinians before the state of Israel. And they said that in a book in Egypt, Cairo Museum, it says that there were no Palestinians before Israel. What do we say about that?
Yeah, I mean, no one says that. I don't know where that information is coming from. I mean, look, historically, no one argues. I mean, even if you look at the Jewish, or not Jewish, sorry, the Zionist references and sources, no one argues that the Palestinians didn't exist there. I mean, that's just absolute nonsense, absurdity, right? The Palestinians always existed in that region. There's no dispute about that, right? The only thing they'll dispute is numbers, dates, who was the first people there, etc., right? And that even when and this becomes a very historical argument, it becomes a semantic argument, it becomes an argument amongst historians. I mean, quite frankly, it's all irrelevant because who has ruled over Palestine? I mean, even if you talk about people, right, is one thing, but when you talk about rule over Palestine, well, then Muslims have ruled over for 1,200 years. And there's no dispute about it. No one's going to dispute that fact. So I think let's focus on, facts, right? So for example, if you look at the sources, they'll say, oh, there was 3% of Jews in Palestine. Some people say, no, there was 20%. Some people say 50%. I mean, I wouldn't get stuck in semantics, even though the Zionist sources are all, obviously they're going to be biased from their perspective, right? So you can refute those, and even if you look at the resources or the sources where generally there's a consensus amongst Western historians, also Eastern historians, how can you dispute that? But I mean, for example, the Zionists still dispute that. But anyway, I think the main thing is no one disputes there was the Palestinians didn't exist there. I was actually looking at a Zionist website. Okay, I forgot what it was called. And they talk about Palestine, the Palestinians, being there for centuries. All right, next question.
How and who gets to define Semitism?
To define what? Semitism?
That's right, yeah.
Anti-Semitism or Semitism?
Semitism.
Semitism. Right, can you hear the question at the back? Yeah, you can, yeah? So who gets to define Semitism? I mean, the Semitic people, right? Again, this is something that the historians and the researchers, they discuss this, right? the Semitic people, it just refers to a people of a certain geography and a language, generally, right? So the Palestinians are Semitic people, just as the Jewish people are Semitic people, right? So sometimes, a lot of times, I mean, I was listening to Omar Suleiman today in a lecture, and he talks about, you know, someone says, oh, the Palestinians are being accused of being anti-Semitic, and he said, how can we be anti-Semitic when we're Semitic ourselves? We can't be anti-Semitic, right? It's like me, you know, saying, you know, I'm against black people and I'm black myself. I mean, you know, it's a bit difficult to be, you know, anti-black when you're black, right?
Yeah.
So that's the point. So the Semitic people is just a definition of reality of people of a certain region and a certain language and a certain background. That's all it is, right? There's nothing.
Sorry, the person who asked that question has just clarified that they actually meant anti-Semitism.
Yeah, that's what I thought they mean, right?
Yeah.
So anti-Semitism, okay, we are going to discuss these things later, and I prefer that we discuss it later, but it's a political tool. The short answer to is it's a political tool that everything and anything is anti-Semitism, right? And that's the point. The point that I'm making is look at history and use history as a criteria. When have the Muslims historically been anti-Semitic? The Jews lived with the Muslims for 1200 years. 1200 years under Islamic rule. It was the Muslims, even at the time of the Byzantine Empire, when the Muslims opened up Palestine, we're going to discuss it, Jews were not allowed in that region. It's a fact. It's not something disputed. It's the Muslims that allowed them back into that region. So, I mean, there's a lot of facts there, and I think it's easy to navigate through this conversation if we stick to facts. So anti-Semitism is a tool, right? It's a fantastic tool that is deployed by the Zionists to shut any criticism, to shut any discussion. You say something, or say you're anti-Semitic, right? So you talk about what's the future of Palestine, or you're anti-Semitic. You're talking about your etc. etc. But we're going to discuss that, and we're going to discuss the arguments in more detail in the future sessions. Next week's session, we're going to be discussing Zionism, right? But maybe week 4 or 5, we start discussing arguments, right? And what arguments that we need to use, how do we build those arguments? And we can discuss that more in detail then, inshallah. All right, next.
Will the Zionists stop with Palestine, or will they expand further?
Right, excellent. I think that's a very good question, right? So the point is, right, I didn't necessarily actually share that I didn't discuss that slide, but if you looked at one of my early slides, there's something which is, there's a concept, right? Again, we should know this. It's called Eretz Israel. Eretz Israel, right? It's on the slides. E-R-E-T-Z, Eretz Israel, which means the greater Israel. In fact, I'm not going to discuss this. I just remembered. You have to watch the video. You know the video that I did this week? Watch the video. What is Palestine, right? And it'll talk about Zionism, and it talks about the plan for the greater Israel. The greater Israel doesn't stop at the current borders. And I've got a fantastic quote from Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion, we talked about last week. He was the founding father. He said they weren't even happy with the partition and the land that they were given in 1947, 1948. So he said, we'll start from here, and then we'll smash our way through these borders until our state encompasses the whole of the greater Israel. The greater Israel goes right into Jordan, and it goes right up to the sea, and it consumes all that. In fact, actually, I'm not joking, it actually includes land from, I think, Saudi, if I remember correctly. Okay. Any other questions, Imran?
Yeah, we have one which asks, how do we know the dates in which the Prophets ﷺ lived?
Yeah, so we can't say accurately that they lived, you know, this year or that year. So for example, even though when you talk about the Prophet ﷺ, what year was he born? There'll be a dispute amongst the historians, maybe 570, 571, you know, whatever. The historians will mention different dates, right? And when you're trying to go back 3,000, 4,000 years before Christ, it's even more difficult. It's not an exact science. That's the point. It's not an exact science. We know roughly, all right? Because there's multiple sources that come together and they indicate and they give us an idea. So for example, everyone knows or it's well known that Ibrahim alayhi salam, we're talking about 2,500 years before Christ. Sulaiman alayhi salam, 1,000 years before Christ. So you got these big milestones, and then they use that as a reference point. And then obviously after Isa alayhi salam, things become a bit more easier. But even then, it's not an exact science. Roughly, we're talking about those time periods, right?
And then just one more. There was a bit of confusion about, and they were requesting some clarification on the fact that Islam ruled for 1500 years, but non-Arab rulership was 3,500 years.
That was historical. So we said the first 3,500 years ago, that region originally was ruled by the Canaanites and the Egyptians. That's you're right. I mean, if we talk about who's been there the longest in terms of from a rule perspective, then it is the Canaanites and the Egyptians, the ancient civilization. But the Canaanites don't exist today. In fact, they do exist today. The Canaanites today are the Lebanese people. The Lebanese people actually originate from the people of Canaan, according to a lot of the historians and the researchers, right? But obviously that's not applicable today. And if you go back to the Egyptians and you talk about the Egyptian the dynasties and the pharaohs, then you still come back to the Muslim people, right?
Yeah, that's fine. I think that's all the questions
All right.
we have
Good.
now.
Okay. All right.
I have another question from the Zoom chat. What's the difference between Judaism and Zionism? It seems the Wailing Wall and worship and the Jewish faith have nothing to do with taking over this land.
Yeah,
Maybe
I mean,
that's
a quick answer to that. I mean, we will discuss it next week, but yeah, there's the two things are completely symmetrically opposed to one another, right? So Zionism has nothing to do with the religion, right? As a short answer, and the Jews and the people of the Jewish faith, they generally distance themselves from Zionism. Zionism itself, or even the original founders of Zionism, you'll see from next week, are atheists, right? And it was more of a political, colonial, economic kind of venture to actually occupy that area. So that's the big difference. I mean, most of the Zionists are atheists, and it has no links to the faith. And that's why it's very important that even when we discuss, we don't discuss in the context of Jews or Judaism. No one discusses Judaism, and it's no one says this is a struggle between Judaism and the Muslims of Palestine. They talk about Zionism and Zionists, right? So this is important to bear that in mind. All right, so we've got everyone back, Imran. I suggest we start.
Yeah. There was another question, but I think we can ask that later.
What was it, very quickly?
Yeah, it is related to Zionism. So it's, do you know if we are allowed to criticize the Zionist ideology legally?
Yeah, of course. I mean, so there is nothing. I mean, we're not discussing anything which is illegal, right? So I mean, obviously, I'd be in a lot of trouble, and I wouldn't be here if I was discussing something illegal, right? So everything we're discussing is within the legal constraints, right? What you're allowed to discuss, what you're allowed to say, and as I said, it's nothing about being anti-Jewish or anything against the faith of Judaism. It's about Zionism and the apartheid, colonial agenda, extremist, fascist agenda of Zionism, right? So all of those words that I've just used are absolutely fine to describe Zionism. That is Zionism, and those are not my words. That's how, for example, you look at Amnesty International at the moment. Amnesty International and so many other human rights organizations, they talk about the Zionist state as an apartheid state. Well, they don't call it Zionist state, they call it Israel, but an apartheid state. So apartheid is being used in those words. The Zionism is a philosophy, and everyone knows about the philosophy, and that is what is driving the current state of Israel, right? So absolutely feel free to discuss, and that's the context we should be discussing it in terms of Zionism, right?
Yeah.
All right, let's move on, and then what we will do is we will inshallah take more questions towards the end. Yeah.
That's fine.
All right, fine. So all right, Bismillah. Let's continue, inshallah. All right. So that was a very quick tour of thousands of years of history. Obviously, the idea is not to go into the detail at all. You can't do something like that, right? The idea is just to give you a taster of the people of that region, the empires, the dynasties that existed at that era, and really put into perspective the Muslim rule over Palestine and that region, right? So that needs to be crystal clear, right? 1200 years of Muslim rule over that region. That needs to be very crystal clear. So where does it start from? Where does it start from? Because up until that time, when you talk about rule, I mean, from our perspective, when we talk about Sulaiman al-Islam, Dawood al-Islam, Musa al-Islam, right? You know, there's so many arguments, but even when you talk about the biblical right to that land from a Zionist perspective or a Jewish perspective, what did the Prophet ﷺ say with regards to Musa al-Islam? The Prophet ﷺ said with regards to Musa al-Islam so many times, right? Even when you talk about Ashura, the fast of Ashura, right? The fast on the day, the 10th of Muharram. What did the Prophet ﷺ say? He said, next year, if I'm alive, I'm going to fast 2 days, right? And when he heard that the people of Medina were, the Jews of Medina were fasting, he said, we have more right over Musa than even the Jews have more right over Musa. So from our perspective, from an Islamic perspective, we have more right over the prophets because we know the prophets were on Islam. We know that they were on Islam. They weren't on any of these deviant, you know, ideologies and faiths. We know that they didn't preach, you know, shirk. They didn't preach, you know, any Trinity business. It was Islam. All the prophets taught Islam. Ibrahim alayhi salam to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, we have more right. We have more right over Sulaiman alayhi salam, Dawood alayhi salam, Musa alayhi salam than any other faith, because we are the ones who are the successors of those faiths, right? So just a side point. But the point now is, we've discussed the historical context. We know the Muslims have been there for the longest period in terms of as rulers over the land of Palestine. How did they get there, right? What's the context? What's the background? How does Islam arrive in Palestine? The Prophet ﷺ said, and I mentioned this hadith last week, go and pray in Masjid al-Aqsa, right? Go and pray there. Go and pray 2 rakats in Masjid al-Aqsa. And if you cannot visit it, and if you cannot pray there, then send some oil to be used in the lamps, in the lanterns of Masjid al-Aqsa, right? So the Prophet ﷺ said, go and pray there. Now, can you see this was the foresight, or this was the prophecy of the Prophet ﷺ? And even the Prophet ﷺ in the Battle of Ahzab, he already prophesied Yemen, he already prophesied all of the other surrounding areas that they will actually come into the fold of Islam, under the ruling of Islam, right? So it's during the time of, so after the Prophet ﷺ passes away, we know the Muslims elected and chose Abu Bakr Siddiq as the first Khalif, and then Umar ibn al-Khattab. We're more interested in Umar ibn al-Khattab from the perspective of Palestine, because it's under Umar ibn al-Khattab that Palestine, Islam enters into Palestine. But I'm not necessarily interested in just the conquest itself, or the details around the conquest and what happened in terms of the conquest. I'll touch upon some of the facts, right, and some of the interesting points. If you haven't heard the stories of the opening of Palestine by the Muslims at the time of Umar ibn Khattab, you need to listen to them. There's loads of videos out there. There's a lot of material out there. Sometimes we're guilty of not actually watching that material, right? Another quick question: who's actually watched the NBC series on Umar ibn Khattab? Right? I mean, if you haven't watched that, some people have watched it. If you haven't watched it, I would tell you to stop doing, watching anything else that you may be watching, and watch that series. It's a fantastic series, mashallah. It's really, really inspiring. And if you go to Islam Channel website, they have it all there, so you can just watch it, right? But we're interested in looking at the conquest and the opening of Palestine by Umar ibn Khattab from the modern perspective. Okay, from the modern perspective, and that's the whole point of everything we're going to be discussing. We're looking at it from the perspective of what was the relationship of the Muslims with the inhabitants of that area, of that region. We're looking at it from the perspective, what was the relationship of the Muslims with the indigenous people of that area, of that region, right? We're looking at how did the Muslims behave as conquerors, as victors, right? And how does it change? How is it different for the Muslims versus others who took over that area, right? So I gave you an example of the Babylons or the Babylonians when they took over and what they did to the Jewish people, what they did to the Temple of Solomon, right? We talked about what the Romans did to the Jewish people and what they did to the Second Temple of Solomon, right? Now Umar ibn Khattab and the Muslims, they are on the outskirts of Palestine. And what was the famous battle that allowed them to open up Palestine? Anyone know? So I don't know what slide number there is. It would have been good if I numbered my slides. I will do next week, inshallah, right? Sorry? 15 slide, yeah? All right. So it was the Battle of Yarmouk. So the Muslims, right? The Muslims under Umar ibn Khattab, Umar ibn Khattab has sent out the army under Khalid bin Walid, right? And Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah to actually open up the lands of the Byzantine Empire at that time. At the time of the Muslims, the big empires were the Byzantine Empire, the Persian Empire, and the Byzantine Empire is like your Eastern Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was split into two for the sake of management and for the sake of other reasons, the East and the West, right? The West was the Roman Empire and the East was the Byzantine Empire, right? So the West, you're talking about the European region, and East, you're talking about Constantine, Turkey, the modern day Turkey, you know, Constantine, the famous, you know, story of Constantine, right? So that's where it used to be the capital of the Byzantine Empire. But even then, they used to also rule over the land of Sham, right? Earlier. And then you had the famous ruler of Byzantium, Heraclius, right? So the Muslims during the time of Umar ibn Khattab, they had sent out expeditions to open up that land to Islam, right? And part of that armies, the part of those armies were led by Khalid bin Walid under the leadership of Khalid bin Walid, but also by the other leaders, right? Including Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah. They were sent to different areas within the Sham area or within the Byzantine Empire to address different battles and different aspects of the Byzantine Empire. And it was during the Battle of Yarmouk that Muslims finally opened up this land of Jerusalem. They captured Jerusalem, and then they obviously lay siege to Jerusalem. Right? And it's an amazing story. Like I said to you, you got to listen to it and you got to read it. And there's people out there who are far more eloquent than I am to actually do justice to the topic, because it requires a lecture in its own right? So the Muslim army led by Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, now they've opened up those lands. They've now surround Palestine or Palestine or Jerusalem, right? Whatever you want to say, right? That area. Maybe Jerusalem is probably the correct term, right? And Jerusalem at that time, as I said to you, it was obviously the Heraclius was the empire, but Jerusalem itself had a patriarch, had the religious head of Jerusalem. What was his name? Sophronius, I think, right? Sophronius, the patriarch Sophronius, very, very historical figure, well-known figure, right? And obviously the Muslims lay siege. Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah is in discussions with the patriarch, the chief, you can say, priest of Jerusalem, the Christian priest of Jerusalem. And during those discussions, he says that the place of Al-Aqsa, this is really interesting. He says the place of Al-Aqsa is so sacred, Jerusalem is so sacred, that we want to hand it all the keys over, but we are unable to hand the keys over until the Amir of the Muslims himself comes and collects the keys. That's how sacred it is, that we can't give the keys of Jerusalem to anyone, right? Or any of the followers, or even though that the followers of the Prophet ﷺ at that time, they had a huge reputation and they were really, really well respected. But he said the status of Jerusalem is as such that the keys can only be handed over to Amir al-Mu'mineen, and he needs to come and collect the keys. Long story short, that the message is sent back to Medina al-Munawwara. The Muslims consult, right? Umar ibn Khattab consults the other Muslims, and then eventually they decide that he will go to Jerusalem to collect the keys. And Umar ibn Khattab then heads out towards Jerusalem to collect the keys of Jerusalem, right? So he heads out to there. He meets with the chief patriarch of Jerusalem. and then he gets the keys from the patriarch, and the Muslims take the rule and the supervision of Jerusalem 637, 638, right? So Jerusalem is surrendered, and then the Umar ibn Khattab, he then comes to an agreement with the people of Jerusalem, right? And these things are absolutely well known, historically documented, and something that all of us need to be familiar with and well versed with, because when people talk about anti-Semitism, people talk about the Jewish people, or people even talk about Christians, then you don't get better examples than Umar ibn Khattab, and the other example we're going to be discussing later, Salahuddin Ayyubi. And they are so well known, you don't really need to, there's not much of an argument, people know it, right? So Umar ibn Khattab, he comes to an agreement with the patriarch, and a lot of the scholars that write about it, they talk about that the terms themselves were much more favorable for the Christian inhabitants of the city. It granted them safety for their lives, right? Again, remember what happened to the Jewish people by the old empires, the Romans, the Babylonians, right? What happened to them? What happened to their places of worship, right? So they're granted the safety of their lives, their property, the places of worship. They're given access to that region. All of that is granted to them. And we know the most famous example, right? That all of these things are given to the Christians and to the people living at that time in that region, right? And the interesting point to note here is we're talking about Christians. Why aren't we talking about the Jews? So it's the Christians that were there, and it's the Christians that are coming to an agreement with the Muslims, right? It's the Christians that are ruling the Byzantium Empire, right? It's the Christian patriarch that Umar ibn Khattab is negotiating with. The treaty is made with the patriarch, right? And the people of that region. Why aren't the Jewish people mentioned in this conversation out of interest? Sorry? They didn't live there. They weren't allowed into that region, right? They were at the time of Islam, when Umar ibn Khattab entered Palestine, the Jewish people were expelled. They were banned from the holy places. They were banned from the holy places, right? So they weren't allowed, and they didn't live in that region, and that's why you don't find that necessarily mentioned, right? Even though there may have been some, but publicly, generally, it's well-known fact that they didn't live there, or they weren't there. They were banned, right? It's Umar ibn Khattab that allowed them back into that region. It's another argument that we need to be aware of, right? In fact, even at that time of the Byzantians, the whole of Al-Aqsa, they had turned that, you probably know this, they had turned that into a rubbish tip, right? There was no respect and for any of that area, okay? Because from a Christian perspective, I guess this is one of the reasons why, because from a Christian perspective, that area necessarily is not holy to them. It's the church that's holy to them, right? It's the church that's the church. I forget the name of the church that's holy to them, or a particular area that's holy to them. Not necessarily the whole of Al-Aqsa. Maybe that's one of the reasons. Maybe, right? I'm saying, right? But nevertheless, it's a known fact that that whole area had been turned into a tip, right? And it's the Muslims that went there during the reign of Umar ibn Khattab and then cleaned up that area. Umar ibn Khattab cleaned it out with the Muslims themselves, right? What else? Then the agreement that Umar ibn Khattab made with the Muslims, the Treaty of Umar. The Treaty of Umar, even to this day, it's there. It's I don't know if it's there at the place of what we're going to discuss next. Outside the masjid, it's there. It's actually inscribed. It's actually there in physical format that you can actually go and you can actually see the agreement that Umar ibn Khattab made with the Christians at that time, right? So what do we find? We find that the patriarchy hands over the keys to Umar ibn Khattab. We find that there's no massacres, there's no killings, right? It's almost like a peaceful opening, right, of the whole of Palestine. We find that there's mutual respect. We find there's tolerance. We find Umar ibn Khattab makes an agreement giving a full, respect, sanctity, access to places of worship to the Christians, to the Christian people. And in fact, he doesn't stop there, right? He writes up this agreement like the Prophet ﷺ before. It's not Umar ibn Khattab. It is Islam that is teaching Umar to do this. It is the example of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Later, when we discuss the Crusaders, they were very, the Crusaders and even the Europeans that came after the Crusaders. One of the things is that they are fascinated by Salahuddin Ayyubi, and they almost try to designate the characteristics and the attributes of Salahuddin Ayyubi to him as a person, not to him because of his faith. Because when you start saying this is because of his faith, then you're giving credence and credibility to the faith. You're recognizing the faith. That is the faith that is shaping up this behavior. When you're giving it to a person, then you're restricting it to one person. So they're very clever the way they do that, right? But it's not Umar ibn Khattab that, of course, he was special as a person, but we know Umar ibn Khattab before Islam and after Islam. What changed Umar was Islam. And what makes Umar ibn Khattab come into these agreements and act the way he acts was Islam, and it was the example of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam acted with the people of Madinah al-Munawwara when he entered Medina. Look at the agreements that he made with the Jews and with the people, non-Muslims of Medina. So Umar ibn Khattab, he's embodying those teachings. So the point that I'm making here is it's Islam. Islam does not allow you to be anti-Zionist. Oh, sorry. Islam does not allow you to, don't quote me on that. Islam does not allow you to be anti-Jewish, right? It ensures that you are actually, giving the due respect to the other faiths, just like Umar ibn Khattab did, right? So that's a very important thing about the agreement that was made, right? Last thing that I wanted to very quickly mention was with regards to I forgot my point now. I forgot the point that I was going to make, but anyway, so I think that's the pertinent point. The pertinent points are the agreement. The pertinent points are how Umar ibn Khattab treats the Muslims, the non-Muslims, the people of the Christian faith, and the Jewish faith weren't present in that area because they were banned. And later, Umar ibn Khattab, then he allows them to enter that region and live in the region and reside there later and have access to those key areas, right? And that starts in 636, right? Any questions on this particular part?
Somebody's asking why were the Jews banned and by who?
So they were banned before under the Byzantium Empire, presumably by the Romans. They weren't allowed in that region at the time of Islam. But this is happening historically. We know it happened under the Romans. It happened under the Babylonians, that they were exiled and they weren't allowed. I mean, in terms of historically, also when you want to understand it, is there was obviously, as I was saying, there was a lot of fighting between the different empires at that time. And there was also fighting between some of those empires and the Jewish people, because the Jews revolted. The Jewish people revolted against the Romans, for example. We know at the time of Isa alayhi salam there was a revolt, right? Also, so they revolted and there was fighting, etc. And so for those reasons they were banned historically on a number of different occasions.
That's the only question at the moment.
All right. Any question from the floor?
Till the end. Unless you want to take a few now. There was also some questions about where did the European Jews originate from?
The European Jews?
Yeah.
Across Europe. Across Europe. I mean, I think I don't have the percentages with me. Maybe I will have some of that information next week in terms of the research. But yeah, a lot of them were from Poland and across the Europe, across Europe, Germany, Britain, Russian Jews, East European Jews, Jewry, a lot of those that migrated during the Zionist project. But we'll be discussing some really interesting facts and figures next week, inshallah, with regards to that.
And I have another question. It's about Hamas, but I think we can do that at the end.
Yeah, we can do that
Otherwise,
later.
I'll see you off
Yeah.
tangent, you
So
know.
with regards to this particular area, right, this is about Islam and the Muslims and the opening of Palestine, right? So the key thing there is how Islam enters Palestine into that region under the leadership of Umar al-Khattab and Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, Khalid bin Walid, etc. That region, and the relationship. The key thing I want to focus on is the relationship, because ultimately where are we going with this conversation is all about relationship, right? There's an argument today is how do these faiths live together peacefully, right? So when you look at when you look at it contemporarily and you look at it historically, then there is no contemporary precedent for all of these faiths to coexist peacefully in the current context. They failed. They haven't. They can't do that themselves. I mean, look at the black people in America, even in Europe, even in Britain. I mean, they have such a problem with people of color, even the way they deal with migrants and immigrants, right? It's no melting pot by any stretch of the imagination. And there's this historical problem of the colonizing, having the imperial mentality, having racist attitudes and towards migrants and towards people of color, right? That they have institutional problem with the racism in all stratas of society, right? And we've seen that in America, we've seen that in Europe, we've seen that in Britain. Massive issue when it comes to this, right? Historically, we can see that Islam has never had a problem with people of other faiths, and Jews, Christians have lived in peace, right, under Islamic rule. But we'll discuss that later anyway, inshallah. Yeah. All right. So that, I think those are the main points that we want to take away from this period. Umar ibn Khattab, the treaty, the rule of Islam, okay, and how the Islamic attitudes were towards the people of other faiths, inshallah, right? So now the Muslims are ruling over Palestine, right? Umar ibn Khattab collects the keys. He puts one of the Sahabi in charge of Al-Aqsa, of Jerusalem, right? In fact, the other point I was going to mention earlier was, remember when Umar ibn Khattab enters and it's a time of prayer. Right? A very, very famous example is something worthy of noting, right? It's the time for prayer. And the patriarch tells Umar ibn Khattab, pray here inside the church. Pray here inside the church. Pray your 2 rakats here inside the church. Umar ibn Khattab, he says, no, I will not pray inside the church. Why does he say that? He says, if I pray inside the church, the Muslims who come after me, they will take this as a legal justification to take over that church. And therefore, I do not want to pray inside. And then he goes outside and he prays in a particular spot. And that's the spot where today you have the Masjid of Umar. It still exists today, right? And that is the place where Umar ibn Khattab, he prayed those 2 rakats and they built a masjid in that place. Just like Umar ibn Khattab, he said, the Muslims will take this as a place of worship. And he maintained the church that was important for the Christian faith. Can you see the attitude of the Muslims towards the places of worship? That's the way the Muslims behave towards other places of worship of other faiths, right? So these are all very, very important points for us to know. Anyway, so the Muslims start now ruling Palestine from the year 636, 637, right? Now the Muslims are ruling over Jerusalem, that area. They ruled over that area under the Umayyads, right? These are the different caliphates, khilafas, right? They ruled over Jerusalem under the Abbasids, under the Fatimids, under the Ayyubids, under the Mamluks, under the Uthmani Khilafah, right? All of these were different dynasties, different families, different, you can say, governments, forms of governments, right? That ruled over the region of Jerusalem from 636 to arguably 1924. That's a massive period in history. Massive period in history. So the Muslims are ruling over that region. But we know that they didn't rule over that region without a break in the middle. When did that break happen? Sorry? Can't hear you. 1099, exactly. Right? So the Muslims are ruling over Jerusalem. So now we all know that then we know that there's this, the Crusaders happen, right? The Crusaders happen, and then the Crusaders take over Jerusalem. But before we go into that, I want to ask you a question. And again, you have to contextualize everything that we're discussing with the view of where are we going with all of this discussion? What's the purpose of this discussion? So the Crusades happen. Did the Muslims launch the Crusades, or did the Christians launch the Crusades? Who launched the Crusades? The Christians launched the Crusades. Did they launch the Crusades because they weren't given access to the holy places? Did they launch the Crusades because they weren't given rights? Did they launch the Crusades because the Muslims didn't respect their churches? Is it because the Muslims were violating the sanctity? Is it because there was sectarian conflicts between the Jews and the Christians and Muslims? What problem existed that necessitated the Crusades? Do you understand? You have to ask yourself this question. What prompted the Crusades? Why was the Crusades necessary? The Muslims are ruling. You're getting full access to your places of worship. The sanctity is maintained. Your churches are maintained. Your places of worship are maintained. You have open access. The Muslims never exiled any other faiths, especially the Christians. So why then the need for this military campaign? And it wasn't a normal military campaign. It wasn't a normal military campaign. So you have to ask yourself these questions. When people talk about the Muslims, when people talk about Islam, when people talk about this label and that label, who are the people historically that have been the barbarians? Who are the ones? Who have been the ones that have not tolerated other faiths? Is it the Muslims? That's when you discuss it in that perspective, then they've got nothing to discuss. They say, oh, forget about the history. We've apologized for our history. Let's move on. And even when they move on, they don't move on genuinely and sincerely. So it's not the Muslims. So the Crusades are launched by the Christian world, right? So the answer to the question in terms of why did they launch the Crusades, right? There's multiple reasons behind that, but we know in 1095, right? And we're taught some of this stuff in schools. But again, when we're taught history in school, we find it boring, A, and B is taught from a certain perspective, and C, we're not interested. So we don't know the counter arguments, right? We never discuss it in that way. But anyway, the Crusades are launched in 1095 by the Christian European nations, right? European nations, let's put it in those words. And they launched the Crusades because listen to this, yeah? They want to reclaim the holy places in the east, including Jerusalem. So do you hear this word reclaim? They want to reclaim, right? So we want to reclaim the holy places. Well, unless you're going back to the Byzantium Empire, 637, right? Now they want to reclaim. So they've galvanized and they mobilized the masses. And obviously, this is a religious war because the basis for gathering and mobilizing the masses was based upon their faith, Christian faith, right? So that's what it was about. It was about whoever goes and gathers together and mobilizes and joins the forces to go and fight these people, blah, 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 blah. You know, they will be promised the forgiveness of Jesus Christ and heavens and so on and so forth. Everyone knows the rest of the story, right? And this was at the behest of Pope Urban II, who called for these crusades. Long story short, what happens is obviously they mass up massive amounts of people, hundreds and thousands of people to join the crusades, and then they head towards Jerusalem. And in 1099, the Crusaders, this is the first crusade, the Crusaders are able to take Jerusalem. So they are successful. That's 1099. In the first crusades, they set out in 1095, and in 1099, they are able to take Jerusalem. That was what's the goal of the crusades? Is to conquer Jerusalem. That's the goal. The stated goal of the crusades is to conquer Jerusalem. In 1099, they arrive in Jerusalem. They arrive in Jerusalem before that, but the fighting takes place and they take over Jerusalem, right? So we're gonna talk about a couple of things here that are worthy of note now. Now, Christian West, the Crusaders have taken over Jerusalem. Now, it's an interesting time to do a compare and contrast. What are we doing a compare and contrast with? 1099 with 637. How did the Muslims take over Palestine? What was the attitude of the Muslims? What was the reaction of the Muslims? How did the Muslims treat the Christians and the Jews, right? And how did the Crusaders? You don't even need to do a compare and contrast because they are ashamed of their own history. They know their history. And as I said to you, full of barbarism, right? So they went into Palestine and they know they're massacred. They're massacred. 1099, the Muslims, the Jews that lived in Jerusalem. No one was spared. No one was spared. Right? Brutal massacres, tens of thousands of deaths in Jerusalem at the hands of the Crusaders. Look at the difference between the Crusaders and how Muslims open up Palestine. In a nutshell, we're talking about, when you talk about the Crusaders, some of these facts will be really interesting. The Crusaders, how many Crusades were there? Anyone know how many Crusades there were? How long the Crusades lasted? Unless you're looking at the slides. Very quickly, the Crusades, 88 years. The Crusades lasted 200 years. 200 years. Yeah? The Crusades. For 200 years, there was a constant crusade. Like I said to you, there was a constant fighting, right? Okay. There was in total 9 major crusades. 9 crusades happened, right? 9 wars or crusader wars that took place, right? There's obviously not exact figures, like I said. Approximately 3 to 6 million Christians died in the crusades. This is just with regards to the Christians. 3 to 6 million Christians died over that period of 200 years, over the period of the 9 crusades. And these are crusades that have been fought and waged by Christian Europe against the Muslims. So in the first crusade, they win, they take over Al-Aqsa, they take over Jerusalem, they massacre the population, and now they're in control of Jerusalem. So then you might ask the question, and we should ask the question, how did they manage to defeat the Muslims? The Muslims, up until that time, had been ruling since 637. Yes. Now it's 1099, right? And the Muslims are defeated. So what happened? What is that time period? It's about 430 years, 435 years. 637 minus 1099. Yes? 400. So Muslims have been ruling for 400 years now. Obviously, as I said to you before, different caliphates, different khilafahs, different empires of the Muslims, right? At the time when the Crusades were launched, and they were the first crusade, when they defeated the Muslims, it was under the Abbasid Caliphate. Abbasid Caliphate at that time. So if you look at the slide, right, it was at that time in the 11th century, late 11th century, when the Abbasid Caliphate under the Khalif al-Mustazir, I think, okay, that the Muslims at that time were divided, right? So Muslims amongst themselves, I mean, you know, sometimes we talk about the Islamic Caliphate, we talk about the Islamic Khilafah, we talk about the Islamic history. I mean, even when we talk about the history right from the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's passing away, you're not going to get a perfect version of history. I mean, it wasn't even perfect at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, meaning the people are not perfect. You have problems in any society. You know, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had wars, he had munafiqs, he had to deal with so many challenges. So that's the nature of human beings, nature of societies, is that you always have problems, right? Human problems, you have to deal with them. So the Muslims, right from the time of the Umayyad Caliphate, at the time of even the Khilafah Rashida, it had its problems. It had problems in the times of Abu Bakr Siddiq, the apostate wars. It had problems at the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab. But the major difference is that the Muslims had some form of political leadership. some form of political leadership. And that some form of political leadership, even when it was weak, it was able to pull itself together, and it was able to bring some dignity and some defense and some respect and some political clout on the international on the international arena. So even when they were attacked by the Crusaders, they still had an army. They were still able to fight, but they were defeated. And sometimes you win, and sometimes you are victorious. But there's no doubt about the fact that at that time, the Muslims were obviously weak. They were divided. Their leadership was divided. The Muslim armies were divided, and therefore the Crusaders were able to take advantage of that, and they were able to take Palestine. Just to give you an example, if you look at the next slide that I'm on at the moment, right? At the time of the 1099 Crusaders victory, the Muslims within the Muslim lands, we know that the Islamic rule is that under the Islamic rule is that you have one leader, one Khalif, right? And the Muslims all live under the rule of one Khalif. That's the Islamic rule. There should not be two Khalifs. But we know at the time of the Crusaders, there was the Abbasid Caliphate, there was the Seljuk Empire, the Seljuk Caliphate, and then there was the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. So we can see that there is all of these domestic problems that we have as Muslims. We're not united. We're not united. And therefore, there's so much politicking going on. There are people who are allying with the Crusades. There are people who are fighting amongst themselves for power and political struggle, etc., etc. So you can see on that background, in that backdrop, it's easy for an enemy to come and take advantage, and that's exactly what happened. They were able to take advantage, and they were able to defeat the Muslims because of that disunity and take over Jerusalem. But key point here is look at the way the Crusaders take over Jerusalem. What is their reaction and how they treat the inhabitants, the indigenous people of Palestine, the Muslims and Jews and so forth, and compare that to the Muslims in the time of Umar ibn Khattab. Now we obviously need to move on, right? But if there's questions, fire them away. Now, for the Palestine is under the rule of the Crusaders, exactly, right? For almost 88 years. Now look at the difference. Yeah. So whilst it's under the rule of the Crusaders, have the Muslims accepted the de facto the status? Have the Muslims accepted the reality? Sorry? Yes and no. Some yeses and some no's, right? Did the Muslims sit down and say, you know what? The Crusaders are in charge. We might as well sit down, accept the reality that the Crusaders are in charge of Jerusalem. Let's sit down, come to a peace agreement, and we let the Crusaders continue with their tyranny and their oppression over the land of Palestine. The Muslims never had that attitude. They were weak, but they never had that attitude. It was land that belongs to Muslims. The whole area belongs to the Muslims. The Muslims have ruled there for nearly 400 to 500 years. Let's say 400 years for argument's sake, right? And it's a land which is a third holiest place under Islam. How can the Muslims just sit there and allow the Crusaders to rule over that region and butcher and massacre the Muslims of that region and other faiths of that region? So the Muslims could never do that, even though it doesn't mean they were perfect. There was a long period of negligence, right? It's mentioned in very, very famous examples and stories that, whilst all of this was happening, the Khalif at that time was chilling. Was chilling. Because they were relaxed. They were in their own world, enjoying the luxuries of life. It had to take people, interestingly enough, scholars to go and account the Khalif, to account the people in responsibility, account the people in governance, right? And to remind them of what's happening in Palestine. And they had to mobilize them. And they had to mobilize the people of power. They had to mobilize the people in the military. They had to mobilize the Khalif and say to him, what are you doing? And look what's happening in Palestine. And for 88 years, the Crusaders continued their tyranny and their rule and their oppression over the people of Palestine, over the people of Jerusalem, for 88 years. And it wasn't until 1187 that it was liberated. But The grassroots work for liberating Palestine doesn't happen in 1187. It didn't happen in 1186. That's the point. So 1099 is lost. Do you think the Muslims sat down and started watching Netflix? Let's and get distracted by other things around them. Yes, they also were distracted by worldly life. I told you the caliphs and the people of power, they were enjoying life, and there was a lot of political struggle, right, amongst the Muslims. People were after wealth, people were after property, people were after rulership, people were after territory, all of those normal things that have happened historically. But the point was, there was large swathes, large groups of the Muslims that were bothered, were determined to get back Al-Aqsa and get back Jerusalem and bring it back under the ruling of Islam, right? And a lot of that, if not majority of it, was led by the scholars at that time, led by scholars, and they are very, very famous and they are known, right? The likes of Asaduddin Shirku, Imamuddin Zengi, right? Nuruddin Zengi. These are people that are well known. And when you talk about Salahuddin Ayyubi, you can't talk about Salahuddin Ayyubi without discussing Imamuddin Zengi or Nuruddin Zengi. Nuruddin Zengi, Imamuddin Zengi, these are famous, right, rulers, imams, scholars, who were the people who were at the forefront of the campaign to liberate Al-Aqsa, to liberate Jerusalem. Do you see? So this is grassroots work to make that the number one concern and the number one agenda item for the people of the day. How can we, and it's so famous about Salahuddin Ayyubi that what did he say? He said, how can I smile? How can I enjoy myself when I know what's happening in Palestine? And wallahi, I'm not lying to you. I mean, look at the last few weeks. I mean, you have to have a very, very, I don't want to offend anyone, but you have to have a very, very cold personality, a cold heart. You have to have a heart of a stone to sit there and enjoy food and go out at night with your family. Not to say, I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's so difficult to do that when you know the Muslims of Palestine are under siege. They have no water, they have no food, they have no healthcare, they have no electricity. And then my son says to me, "Oh, Dad, can you order this takeaway for me? And can you order that takeaway for me? And can you get that for me?" I'm not saying to you that it's not, we're not allowed to go get a peri-peri meal or go and have a night out on a Friday night. We can't do that. But I mean, think about it. Just think about it. How difficult it is for any person with any iman. And I said, one of the khutbahs that I gave not too long ago is that wallahi, we really need to question our iman, our faith. If we haven't changed over the last few weeks, you have to question your iman. You have to question your faith. If you can just sleep the way you slept before, if you can live the way you lived before, if you can eat the way you ate before, if you can just go out on a Friday night and a Saturday night the way you did, if you can just do that and life has not changed for you, then I would say question your iman. You have to question your belief, right? Because these are the scenes, and this is a genocide that has impacted even non-Muslims. Non-Muslims are researching Islam, researching the Islamic faith, and the way it's waking up conscious in people that are of no faith. What about the people of faith? So if you can imagine the way we agitate, the way we see these scenes, the people in 1187 or in the 11th century, 12th century, they didn't see everything on WhatsApp. I mean, you have everything. I mean, this is, a lot of people are discussing, this is the first time a genocide is unfolding right in front of your eyes. Everyone is witnessing it. Everyone is a witness to the genocide because you see it on your screens. You see it on your tablets. You see it on your phones. And yet the world is silent. Imagine in those times, there was no tablets. There was no Wi-Fi. There was no WhatsApp messaging. Someone had to travel for weeks from Al-Aqsa. And the famous sheikh, I forget his name, very, very famous historian. He leaves Al-Aqsa and he goes to the capital of the Khilafah in those times. I forget where it was, whether it was Baghdad or whether it was Egypt. I can't remember, right? Or maybe it was Damascus. He goes and he travels weeks and he goes to the capital And he says, I want to speak to the Khalif. And the Khalif, obviously, he was a person, he was a VVIP, right? So you can't get access to a VIP, right? So he goes to the central mosque in the time of Ramadan. This is the middle of Ramadan. And the cut long story short, they mentioned that he went in the middle of the day in the month of Ramadan, and he goes there to the front when the sheikh is giving his khutbah, and he starts to eat in the middle of the day, in the day of Ramadan, and people are saying, what are you doing? And there's an outcry. You can imagine, right? In the middle of the day in Ramadan, in the middle of a Jummah khutbah, in the central mosque, in the capital of the caliphate at that time, and there's an outcry. What is this man doing? And he's no ordinary man. He's a well-known, recognized sheikh at that time, and he says that you are bothered about me eating in the middle of a day in the month of Ramadan, where whilst the sanctity of the third holiest place in Islam is being violated, the Muslims' lives are being violated, the women are being violated, and you're talking to me about this, about Ramadan and the fasting of Ramadan. His point to do something so outrageous like that was to draw the attention and get the people focused, and that got the result. And people suddenly now they're paying attention to what's happening in Al-Aqsa, and he's able to mobilize that kind of conscientious or the consciousness and the iman and the aqidah of the people, and he's able to draw the attention of the Khalif. Do you understand what I'm saying? So these kind of things, it's not the fact that it was a perfect utopia under the Caliphate. It wasn't a perfect utopia under the Caliphate, but you definitely didn't get what you got a couple of days ago, the Arab and the Islamic League. If you saw the Arab Islamic League 2 days ago, they all gathered together in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia. By Allah, you have to see, and if you haven't seen it, that's because you're watching the wrong channels. You're watching BBC Sky News. Don't watch them. Watch Al Jazeera. You have to see the palaces that these people gathered in. You just look at the rooms that they met in. It's the most opulent, extravagant gathering of these most useless individuals. They all gather together wearing their £1,000 robes and all of this, nonsense. And they all get together and they do nothing. And even the few words they say are absolutely meaningless, useless, right? So that's what you have today. You never had that even in the worst state of affairs under Islam. The Muslims still had Islam. They still had some iman, and they still had a system. They had a khilafah. They were disunited and fragmented in terms of some of its political reality, but they still had that, and they were still able to mobilize those armies. So when that becomes more pronounced, the scholars, they mobilize the masses, they mobilize the Khalif, they mobilize the armies, and then it was due to the likes of Imamuddin al-Zengi, Nuruddin al-Zengi, that they make the number one issue of the day the liberation of Al-Aqsa. That's what they lived for. They made that the number one agenda item. You didn't, the only thing these people did discuss was the liberation of Al-Aqsa. It's like when you talk about Muhammad al-Fatih. If you've watched the cartoon Muhammad al-Fatih, you talk about these are the people who slept and woke and dreamt and all they thought about was, how do I fulfill the prophecy of the Prophet ﷺ and open up Constantine to Islam? That's what these people lived. They had a vision, they had an objective, they had a goal, and that was their goal. So anyway, so these scholars, they mobilize the masses, they mobilize the opinion, they mobilize the people, and they didn't see the liberation of Palestine during their lives. Imamuddin Zengi passed away, Nuruddin Zengi all passed away. It was their work and their grassroots work that then led to the likes of Salahuddin Ayyubi. Salahuddin Ayyubi was young at that time, but he was with them. That they then built the alliance, and then Salahuddin Ayyubi, he picks up this cause, right? And he raises within the ranks of the military. He was also a military. He was a commander in the army in the Zengid dynasty, and then he enters Egypt, and then he gets into a position of leadership within Egypt, and then he quickly, whatever reasons and however he does, he gets promoted to the ranks of Egypt, and eventually he becomes the ruler in Egypt. When he becomes the ruler of Egypt, long story short, the first thing he does is he unites the people. He unites the Muslim lands. So the first battles that he has to fight is against his own people to unify them. He unifies his own people. He unifies the military, and he unifies them all under this agenda of liberating Al-Aqsa. And then eventually, we know in 1187, he's able to go and liberate Al-Aqsa. 1187. And he obviously lays siege to Jerusalem, and in 1187 he opens up Al-Aqsa to Islam under Muslim rule once again after a break of 88 years. So the point here first is it's not a what's the word? It's not a story. It's not a fairy tale story. Things do not happen. They've never happened. They didn't happen for the Prophet ﷺ. They didn't happen for Salahuddin Ayyubi, and they will not happen for us. It doesn't happen by sitting at home and just raising your hands in dua, expecting Allah to do a direct military intervention on your behalf. It doesn't happen like that. There's a lot of work. All of us, every single individual is responsible for doing their grassroots works, raising the awareness, making this an agenda item, making the reality of Palestine. What is historical Palestine? What is Palestine? What is the cause, the oppression, the apartheid, etc., etc.? Who are the rightful owners, rulers of Palestine? All of this agenda, whatever styles and means we use, we all have a responsibility, and everyone's responsibility is different, ability is different, capability is different. Whatever it is, we need to make it that agenda item. We do that. We sow our seed. We sow one seed. We sow two seeds. It is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Maybe my seed that I sow might not flourish. Imamuddin Zengi, he did what he did. Nuruddin Zengi did what he did. Other shuyukhs did what they did, but they didn't see the fruits. Musa alayhi salam, for decades and decades and decades, he tolerated the Bani Israel, and his ambition, one ambition was that before he dies, he wants to enter Al-Aqsa. That was it. All he wanted was, oh Allah, allow me to enter into Masjid Al-Aqsa. I mean, why was this place so special? That was the desire of Musa alayhi salam. But Musa alayhi salam passes away. He does not see, and he does not enter, and he does not see the victory. So we have to sow our seeds. We have to do what's our responsibility. The rest we leave to Allah. Let me just wrap up and continue to say, now compare and contrast again 1187 with 1099. Do you see what I'm saying? Now you compare Salahuddin Ayyubi with 1099 with the Crusaders. And this is why they were so not mesmerized, but they were so impressed by the Muslims, by Salahuddin Ayyubi. 1187, Salahuddin Ayyubi enters into Jerusalem. They butchered and massacred the Muslims. What do you expect from Salahuddin Ayyubi? Salahuddin Ayyubi, he enters into Jerusalem and he pardons all of the people. Right? He comes into a truce known by the name of Truce of Ramallah, right? And he gives guarantees the safety to the Christian residents of the city of the place. He comes into a truce to allow the Christian pilgrims to visit the holy sites in Jerusalem, and he gives the pardon to the people, and there is no massacre, there is no killing, there is no expelling, there is no desecrating, there is no violating any places of worship, and that is why they always remember Salahuddin Ayyubi. Salahuddin Ayyubi, and that's Islam. And Salahuddin Ayyubi, Umar ibn Khattab, great personalities, and we don't take nothing away from them, but we say it's Islam. And I will tell you today, wallahi, by Allah, I can put it on this on a piece of paper for you. I don't know if it's worth much, but in the future Khilafah, when a Khilafah does re-emerge, you would expect the same behavior as you found under Salahuddin Ayyubi. Just because they massacre our people doesn't mean that we have to do the same. No, Islam doesn't allow us to do that. We have the moral high. The only people who have a moral high ground are the Muslims. Based upon your history, it's only the Muslims that have the moral high ground. The Western nations have no moral high ground. They never had it. They never had it in Iraq. They never had it in Afghanistan. They never had it in any of their wars in the entire history. They are a history of colonizers, of people who have committed mass genocide, and that's their history. That's why they have to go around the world apologizing, because that's what they've done around the world. All of these problems you see are because of these people. It is the Muslim people who have lived, who have allowed people to live, and who have ruled with true justice. And that's what you see in Salahuddin Ayyubi, and you saw that with Umar Khattab. My point is because of Islam. And when you have personalities like that coming back again, that's the justice that they can expect, and they know that. That's why they they tarnish Islam and they tarnish the Muslims. But anyway, so that's 1187. We're back now to the Muslims ruling Jerusalem, all right? And then that's it. 1187, the Muslims continue to rule over Palestine all the way to the very, very recent era, right? There was a short period of time, like I said to you before, right? So remember how many crusades were there? 9 crusades, right? So what crusade are we on now with Salahuddin Ayyubi conquering Al-Aqsa? So the first crusade, the Crusaders win, right? Then the Muslims are obviously defeated. So then behind the scenes, there's another 8 crusades that take place. Now the crusades that are taking place, they're taking place to recapture Al-Aqsa from the Muslims, because the Muslims have captured Al-Aqsa 1187. All of those crusades, generally speaking, they all failed because they never ever were able to recapture Jerusalem. There's one crusade which they talk about, which is in the fifth crusade, when the Christians or the Crusaders, I should say, regained control of Al-Aqsa for a very, very short period of time. But it's not generally discussed and mentioned, and that's why it's not well known. The only well-known Crusader victory is mentioned is 1099, right? After that, we know that the Muslims ruled over Palestine all the way to the recent 1917, 1924, this period when the Zionist project starts, right? So there you go, 1200 years approximately of Muslim rule over the whole region, inshallah, right? All right, so that brings us up to the 1920s, inshallah. So next week when we get together, we then start discussing, all right, what happens, because now we're talking about Jerusalem or Al-Aqsa under the Osmani Khilafah or the Ottoman Empire, right? Everyone knows about the Ottoman Empire, obviously of Turkey, right? Well, not Turkey, but modern day Turkey, right? This was obviously the great, you know, all of you have, I'm sure, watched the series of Ertugrul Ghazi, Osman Ghazi, Orhan Ghazi, you know, and all of that. So this is the Osmani Khilafah of Osman Ghazi, Orhan Ghazi, and then Suleiman, you know, the Magnificent, and all of these great, you know, Khalifs who after that ruled and opened up that land and continued to govern over this region all the way to the last Khalif, who was Sultan Abdul Hamid II, right? So the Sultan Abdul Hamid II is the last Khalif of the Osmani Khilafah, and it's during that period of time now when this whole politicking and this Zionist project starts. And then we discuss what happens, how it starts, what was the background to it, and then, you know, how does the land of Palestine get lost as a second time or a third time, inshallah, right? So that's what we'll discuss next week. So we come up to contemporary time, inshallah, yeah. All right, Jazakallah khair. Let's very quickly. I know it's 8:30, so we can take any questions now, inshallah, very quickly. And if you want to leave, you can also leave. So we're going to leave it open, inshallah. But just to say, we've officially ended, but we'll have questions and answers. So let's see if there's any questions, Imran, from the Zoom community, and then let's see community the questions from the floor here. If there's any questions, just please don't feel shy and raise your hands. You can WhatsApp them or you can even Zoom them.
Yeah. So there's been a question.
Imran, we've got a question from the floor. Let's take the question from the floor. Yeah.
Okay,
you just ask your questions on Zoom. Yeah. All right, brother.
You mentioned the night of Nuruddin Zengi and Asaduddin
Shirgu, yes.
Are there any biographies that you could read or anything that?
I would say, okay, so the question from the floor is, okay, we mentioned Mahmuddin Zengi, Nuruddin Zengi, we mentioned the uncle of Salahuddin Ayyubi, Asaduddin Shirgu. I would actually recommend to you, you know, what's that Sheikh's name in Birmingham? Sheikh Zahir Mahmood, right? Listen to some of his lectures on Salahuddin Ayyubi and the Zengi dynasty. I mean, I think he did some brilliant seminars on Salahuddin Ayyubi and the Zengi dynasty, right? But there are books also out there, but I think books out there, I mean, even I haven't really read a lot of books, right? If I'm going to be honest with you, I listen to a lot of lectures, I listen to a lot of seminars, I do my own research. But initially, as a starting point, listen to the lectures. I mean, they're delivered in a fantastic way, very powerfully delivered, and he covers a lot of information. I would recommend that as a starting point. But there's a lot out there, man. All right. Any other questions?
Yeah, so we got some questions from Zoom. Am I good to
Just,
go with that?
just before question, one thing I forgot to say, right? If we can ask the brothers and sisters on Zoom and plus on the floor, if you can please leave feedback on the YouTube channels, right? That would be very, very useful. So inshallah, we will be. If you remember the first session last week, we issued that and we put it onto YouTube. So this session will also also being broadcast live on YouTube at the moment, and I believe everything is being well today. Alhamdulillah, right? So you're going to be able to go there, leave comments. Please leave comments, etc., etc. Jazakallah, right? All right, go on, bro. Imran, questions, yeah.
Yeah. So one about the leaders actually. So somebody said they've been told that we're not allowed to criticize Muslim leaders of their rule. What is the Muslim view on this when we have corrupt leaders? And then another question which links to that is, how can Muslims unite when we have multiple Muslim rulers?
Yeah, so it's a very good question about Muslim rulers. I mean, it's a topic that's not really, to some extent, is not discussed as it should be discussed, in my opinion, right? So you see the contrast, don't you, between Al-Aqsa, lost at the hands of the Crusades, and how it was the Muslim scholars that led the way to mobilize the masses and mobilize the leadership towards liberating Al-Aqsa once again. And it's the responsibility of the masses and the scholars once again to do that. I mean, today, unfortunately, we're in a state of affairs where, you know, the Muslim lands have been divided. You got nation states, you got all of these puppet regimes, and they're not interested in anything apart from just running the agenda of America. So of course we have to speak out against them, and we have to call back for, just like I said at the time of the Crusades, the Muslim lands were disunited and they had to be united. Salahuddin Ayyubi could not have liberated and fought the Crusaders without unifying the Muslim forces, without unifying the Muslim lands. He had to do that. That was the starting point. And the starting point today for the Muslims also is that they have to be under Islamic rule. Islamic rule means not nationalistic rule. It means under Islamic rule. It means under Islamic Khilafah system, right? Which unifies the Muslim lands and uses the Islamic, you know, resources, the military resources, the personnel, the human resources to re-liberate the land of Palestine as it was liberated before. The people who say that we're not allowed to do that are not speaking from correct Islamic understanding. I mean, no one's well, a few people still say that, but generally people know that it's a responsibility to speak out against batil, to speak out against fisk, and to speak out against corruption, right? So this is well known from Quran and Sunnah. All right, next.
Yeah, so when there's a question is a bit confusing. When the Muslims took over Jerusalem, the Christians asked in their contract to not let Jews in. Some opinions said that this part was fabricated. Is that true?
Yeah, there is some point with it. Yeah, go on.
I said I've never heard that, but I mean, I don't know. I just thought I'd ask it just to make
No,
sure.
there is something about that. I can't remember exactly what it is. But there is something to do with that. But I know that during the time of Umar al-Khattab, when he reopened that, then, you know, the people of the Jewish faith were allowed back into that area. There may have been some restrictions. There may have been some conditions around it, but Allahu A'lam.
And then a question about the Crusades. If the Christians conquered during the first Crusade, why were there 8 more?
There were 9 crusades in total, right? So definitely there were more crusades. As I said, 9 crusades over a period of 200 years, right? So the interesting question is, why were they never able to reconquer and Palestine and Jerusalem over from the Muslims after that first crusade? And it's an interesting question, but the historical there's multiple reasons, from the fact that if you think about the crusades just for a moment, I don't think people have really appreciated that. You know, where were these military forces coming from? They were coming from Europe. So you're coming from all the way from Europe to the Middle East to Jerusalem. I mean, now you take a flight to Jerusalem, it's about 6 hours, 5-hour flight, right? If you were traveling from Mecca to Al-Aqsa back in the days of the Prophet ﷺ, it was probably, I think, a month, 2 months of travel, right? So you're talking about 2 months of travel, more or less, right? So you are now trying to bring up muster forces and they have to travel for 2 months even before they fight the battle, right? And the Muslims are living in all of that region. That is all Muslim territory. So the advantage is always going to be on the side of the Muslims. And then obviously the Muslims were fast, once they were united under the Salahuddin Ayyubi, not to say they continued, in terms of a homogeneous bloc and a united bloc, but generally speaking, the Muslims, then after that protected Al-Aqsa, and they were able to protect Al-Aqsa successfully. And there were a number of battles, and some of those battles, smaller battles, some of those Crusaders won, and some of those the Muslims won. But the Crusaders were never able to take Al-Aqsa again, apart from for a short period of time, few years during the Fifth Crusade. Overall, every other crusade failed.
Yeah. Okay, and then the juicy question at the end: why is the Palestinian armed force known as Hamas being criticized as extremists? So therefore, any retaliation is seen as an attack rather than defense. And the other part of that question is: where do we as Muslims stand with Hamas, and is the PLO doing anything?
Yeah, so I mean that's a massive question. I mean it's very, very politically driven question, right? And obviously at the moment, from a legal perspective, then we can't discuss Hamas as a obviously from a legal perspective, we need to be careful about what we say and how we say it, right? But let's talk about Palestinian resistance. Forget about Hamas. Let's discuss Palestinian resistance. Now, even if you actually refer to the United Nations and the United Nations Charter, whether it's Charter Article 51 or some of the others that a lot of the commentators quote today, then the United Nations, even if you use that as a reference point, and we don't use that as a reference point because it's flawed, it's a tool set up by the colonialists for the colonialist agenda, right? But even from their perspective and their charter, any nation who is attacked is allowed and has a legal right and has an international right to resist occupation. That's why when you talk about Ukraine, they talk about Ukraine having the full right to resistance against the Russian occupier, right? And they are fully, on board of discussing that and supporting that. And you saw schools, colleges, universities, every institutions, corporates, all supporting Ukraine. Oh, Ukraine this, Ukraine that. But when it comes to Palestine, they don't afford it the same principles when it comes to them, the Palestinian people, defending their land and their property, just like any other resistance movement that is occupied by a foreign colonizer and a foreign occupier. So that's where the contradiction comes into it. That's where the hypocrisy comes into it. That is where this whole 75 years of struggle comes in, and that's we need to stand that struggle. And the way they actually then shape that struggle is say, oh, they're extremists, or they're Hamas, or they're this and they're that. And that's a ploy that is used to discuss resistance. It's as if the whole of the resistance in Palestine is all about Hamas. It's nothing to do with Hamas. Well, part of it is to do with Hamas, but it's the whole Palestinian people that are fighting for liberation of the Palestinian land. It's a resistance movement, just like you had a resistance movement working against apartheid in South Africa, at the hands of Nelson Mandela, and we all know famously that they used to call him, and even the European nations, they used to call him and refer to him as a terrorist, until later they started to change their narrative. So the long story short is, we are going to discuss Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. We're going to discuss Fatah movement. We're going to discuss Hamas later, inshallah, when we start discussing the Palestinian resistance, right, and the Palestinian politics, right? But in a long story short, the PLO has no credibility with the Palestinian people. The PLO has a credibility only with the Americans, the Western institutions, Western states, okay, because it does their work. But it's a lot more complicated than that. I mean, but we'll discuss some of it, inshallah, in the coming weeks. All right.
Okay, there's no more questions from Zoom. So unless you have any from the floor, I think we've stretched it.
We've got one question, yeah.
I want to ask, the nowadays college,
Yeah.
They don't do or talk much about regarding liberating Palestine, unlike old scholars, for example, Imam has been.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, very, very good question from the floor. from one of our youngsters, mashallah, he's saying that the imams of today, they do not discuss Palestine and the liberation of Palestine, in the way that the scholars of the past discussed it, right? And that's absolutely true. You can imagine, firstly, it's their responsibility to discuss it. That's the first thing. First and foremost, it is their responsibility to discuss it. Then the second thing is that it depends in where you are. I used to live in Dubai, and I lived there many years. When I used to live in Dubai, this Gaza war is 5th Gaza war. There's been 4 previous wars like what we're seeing today. And I remember, I think it was 2014 or maybe it was later, that the war in Gaza was happening. If you actually went to the mosques on a Friday, you would not hear the Imam even discuss Gaza. He wouldn't even mention the word Gaza. He wouldn't even mention what's happening there, even though hundreds and thousands of people are being killed. Because those Imams are controlled by the governments. So the governments will only allow them to say certain things. If you look up the press in the Gulf states, they don't even mention Gaza, some of them. Gaza is not even mentioned. They might mention it as a side story on somewhere, right at the bottom somewhere. Right? That's because they are controlled by the governments. The governments control them. They appoint them. They read out the khutbah that they're given by the governments, and they paid a nice salary, and therefore you stay quiet. That's how they control that narrative. But, right, and then that's the dynamics in some of the Muslim world. Here, the dynamics are, people get intimidated, they get scared by the laws, they get scared by the government, legislation. Even though legislation doesn't stop you from discussing it, you can discuss it like we're discussing it. We're not saying something which is illegal. You're saying that the land of Palestine belongs to the Muslims, belongs to the Palestinian people, and that land is an occupied land. It's a colonized land by a foreign colonialist apartheid regime. And that apartheid regime and that land needs to be liberated. So you can say that. There's nothing wrong with saying that. But unfortunately, our imams sometimes they even hesitate to say something like that. Right, so we need to remind the imams that it's their responsibility. We need to remind the imams of their predecessors, right? And that's why it's also our responsibility to speak to the imams, to put the pressure on the imams, and to put pressure on other people of responsibility to speak out. So, for example, Muslim councillors, Muslim MPs, right? We know a lot of them have sat on the fence, not said anything, and some of them have completely not said something, and some of them have eventually been pressurized to make statements and speak out, right? So that is the kind of a responsibility that we have as a community to go and speak to the imams and make them address that. And even if they don't want to address it in a particular way, let them address it in a way that they feel appropriate. Yeah. All right, Jazakallah khair. I think we're fast running out of time. So I think Jazakallah khair to everyone. If there's any other questions, please leave them on Zoom. Please leave your feedback on the YouTube live stream, inshallah ta'ala. Jazakallah khair for everyone online.